the man known to history as Wilhelm II, Kaiser of the German Empire, was born as Friedrich Wilhelm Victor Albert on the 27th of January 1859 in the Kronprinzenpalais on Unter den Linden Boulevard in the center of Berlin, which was the capital of the Kingdom of Prussia, the greatest of the North German states. His father was Prince Frederick William, the second in line to the throne of Prussia. At the time of Wilhelm's birth, his great-uncle, King Frederick William IV, was the ruler of Prussia, although he had suffered several strokes from 1857 onwards and was so incapacitated after 1858 that Wilhelm's grandfather, also Wilhelm, was the de facto ruler by the time of young Wilhelm's birth. 2 years later, in 1861, old Frederick William IV died, and so Wilhelm's grandfather succeeded as King Wilhelm I. This meant that Prince Frederick William was now the heir to the throne, and 2-year-old Prince Wilhelm was second in line. Wilhelm's mother was Victoria, the eldest daughter and child of Queen Victoria of Great Britain. This meant that Wilhelm was the British Queen's grandson and a close cousin of the members of the British royal family for decades to come. Wilhelm was Victoria and Frederick's oldest child. They would have several others, though 2 sons died quite young. One of his siblings, Sophia, born in 1870, would become the Queen Consort of Greece for a time in the 1910s and early 1920s. A major factor in assessing Wilhelm's life was how he entered the world. His birth was a difficult one. He was in the breech position when Victoria went into labour, meaning he was coming out bottom first rather than head first, something which was still a significant enough complication in the mid-19th century to endanger either the life of the mother, the infant, or both. The doctor delivering Wilhelm, Edward Arnold Martin, made a number of errors thereafter, administering too much chloroform for pain relief, something which was a relatively novel form of sedation in the late 1850s, and then tearing the brachial plexus of Wilhelm while he attempted to speed along the delivery. The latter resulted in a condition called Erb's palsy, which left Wilhelm's left arm permanently damaged. He was able to use the arm, but its development was stunted, and it was about 6 inches shorter than his right arm. The excessive use of chloroform and the difficult delivery also resulted in a temporary lack of oxygen to Wilhelm during the delivery, and it has been speculated that he suffered from a very mild form of brain damage which made him hyperactive as a child. In the long run, the damage to his arm was probably the more consequential. Many historians have speculated that Wilhelm's more aggressive tendencies as ruler of Germany decades later were the result of insecurities brought about by his disability. Young Wilhelm was raised in a manner typical of royalty in the 19th century. He was provided with private tutors from infancy, amongst whom were some of the best teachers Germany had to offer at the time. When he was just 4 years old, Wilhelm travelled to England for the first time to meet his extended family. The occasion was the marriage of his uncle, Prince Albert Edward, the future King Edward VII, to Princess Alexandra of Denmark. There, his restless nature was on display. Back home in Prussia, his mother obsessed over him. Guilt clearly weighed on her, as misplaced as it might have been, that she had been in some way responsible for Wilhelm's disability. She compensated for this by trying to encourage him to be able to do all the things that any Prussian prince would be expected to do, a tendency which only exacerbated the problem. What made things even more difficult is that Prussia was a martial society, one which had developed centuries earlier as a knightly state on the frontiers of Europe, spreading Christianity to the pagan Balts and Vents of the Baltic Sea region. For much of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Prussian military was acknowledged as the greatest army in Europe. The combination of being mired in a military society while also being slightly disabled and having difficulties with both holding a gun and riding a horse would create insecurities in Wilhelm which impacted on his entire life. By the time Wilhelm was born in 1859, a process was already underway that would shape Germany's history and Wilhelm's life over the next century. Germany, a region which had historically included Austria and some other small parts of neighboring countries, had been united a millennium earlier under the rule of Charlemagne, the king of the Franks and the first Holy Roman Emperor. Owing to a process of decentralization of imperial power between the 10th and 13th centuries, Germany fragmented into hundreds of principalities, duchies, counties, ecclesiastical states, and imperial cities, all virtually independent, though tied together loosely through the Holy Roman Empire. Where other countries were united under centralizing powers like the Crown of France and those of Castile and Aragon in Spain, in the 15th and 16th centuries, Germany continued as a disunited region after the Austrian Habsburgs failed to create a more centralized state under their control through the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648. What changed matters was the rise of liberal nationalism across Europe in the first half of the 19th century, following the example of the French Revolution. By then, the Holy Roman Empire was gone, abolished as an outdated institution by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1806, while several dozen German states had emerged as the core rulers of Central Europe. Prussia in the north and east and Austria in the south were the two most powerful. It remained to be seen if the two could come to an arrangement to unite together with the other German states like Bavaria, Saxony, Baden-Oldenburg and Mecklenburg to form a new unified Germany, or if Prussia and Austria would seek to dominate the German states to the exclusion of their great rival. In the end, this process would be dictated by a Prussian Junker, or landed aristocrat, by the name of Otto von Bismarck. A somewhat aimless, heavy-drinking noble in his youth, Bismarck emerged as a skilled diplomat for Prussia in the 1850s, and then, in 1862, was appointed by Wilhelm's grandfather as minister-president and the foreign minister of Prussia. Within weeks, he delivered a fiery speech in the Prussian House of Representatives, in which he stated that Germany would be united through blood and iron. A year and a half later, Prussia went to war with the Kingdom of Denmark to wrest control of the provinces of Schleswig and Holstein from it on the southern side of the Jutland Peninsula. 2 years later, a war followed with Austria. In this, Bismarck managed to destroy the German Confederation, an association of most of the German states under Austrian leadership, replacing it with the North German Confederation, dominated by Prussia. Finally, in 1870, Bismarck engineered a diplomatic spat with France over the succession to the throne of Spain, where France opposed the accession of a German prince to foment the Franco-Prussian War. In this, the Prussians and their allies amongst the smaller German states won a swift victory. Then, to conclude affairs, Bismarck convinced the German states to unite under Prussian leadership, forming the German Empire in a ceremony held at the Royal Palace of Versailles outside Paris on the 18th of January 1871. This excluded Austria and ensured that the new unified German state was dominated by Prussia, with King Wilhelm becoming Kaiser Wilhelm I. The resulting changes to the balance of power in Europe, with Germany emerging as one of the most powerful European nations, rivaled only by Britain and Russia, created issues which would dominate Wilhelm's future reign as Kaiser. At home in Prussia, young Wilhelm's life was not immediately impacted on by German unification, though he was old enough to have been aware of a slight change in the way the court functioned, with his grandfather now becoming an emperor, the Kaiser, rather than a king. Not long after this shift in the court ceremony, Wilhelm was sent to the city of Kassel in the Hesse region of central Germany. There he attended the Friedrichs-Gymnasium for several years, one of Germany's greatest educational institutions, where the brothers Grimm had been educated several decades earlier. Thereafter he attended the University of Bonn, where he studied politics and law, showing considerable promise in these areas. Once that was finished, it was believed that he should spend some time in the Prussian military, and did so, being stationed as part of the 1st Regiment of Futzguard at Potsdam, outside of Berlin, for a time in the early 1880s. It was during these years that his desire to be viewed as a Prussian soldier emerged, perhaps in emulation of his father, who had served in the wars against Denmark, Austria and France in 1864, 1866 and 1870 with considerable distinction, leading the Prussians to several victories in Austria and commanding divisions in both the decisive Battle of Sedan and the Siege of Paris during the Franco-Prussian War. By the time of his military service, Wilhelm was a married man. A union with Augusta Victoria of the House of Schleswig-Holstein, a Danish-German princely family, was arranged in the course of 1880, and the pair, who were very close in age, Augusta being just 3 months older, married on the 27th of February 1881. They would have 7 children. A boy, Wilhelm, came quickly in 1882, followed by Eitel Friedrich in 1883, Adalbert in 1884, August Wilhelm in 1887, Oskar in 1888, and Joachim in 1889, and finally, a girl named Victoria after her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother in 1892. All of the children would survive infancy and childbirth and would reach adulthood. As they were coming into the world, their father was emerging as a man in his 20s with a complex personality. He was a relatively intelligent man with a good imagination, but he was headstrong, was willful in ignoring advice from men more experienced than himself, prone to bouts of depression, and underneath his bravado and surface confidence, he was an extremely insecure individual, one whose desire to prove himself to others and the world would become a destructive quality. Wilhelm's difficult personality would create problems within the politics of the German Empire in years to come. However, there was already a problem as early as the 1870s. It didn't appear to be one at that time. In fact, the problem actually looked like the solution. Its name was Otto von Bismarck. After German unification in 1871, Bismarck took up the new post of German Chancellor. He dominated the politics of the German Empire in the 1870s and 1880s, somehow balancing the many disparate parts of the new state and always finding a working majority in the Reichstag, the German parliament, to deliver policies which drove Germany forward. In the 1870s, for instance, he formed an alliance with the liberals in order to undermine the power of the Roman Catholic Church in southern Germany. Then, in the 1880s, despite his aversion to socialist policies, he introduced a series of socialist measures to improve workers' rights and living standards, specifically with the goal of offsetting the development of any radical socialist politics in Germany. He was unquestionably one of the most brilliant statesmen in modern history. And this was the problem. He turned 70 years in 1885 and could not be expected to rule and govern forever. Nor was Wilhelm of a disposition to essentially devolve all power to an Iron Chancellor. Once Bismarck was gone, the disparate political groups and constituencies within Germany would become far less easy to manage. Bismarck would not go quietly into the good night. Instead, he would be given his marching orders in his mid-70s. The precursor to this was the events of 1888, the so-called Year of the Three Emperors in German history. On the 9th of March that year, old Kaiser Wilhelm I died at 90 years of age. He was succeeded by Wilhelm's father, Frederick III. He was 56 years old and under normal circumstances might have reigned for a good 10 to 20 years, given the growing life expectancies of the 19th century. However, Wilhelm's father had begun to manifest signs of illness early in 1887, becoming easily hoarse and losing his voice. Various experimental medical treatments followed, and so it was only 3 days before the old Kaiser died that Frederick learned that he was suffering from cancer of the larynx. His condition deteriorated rapidly, even as he assumed the throne, and he died after just 99 days as emperor on the 15th of June, 1888. And so it was that Wilhelm succeeded as Kaiser Wilhelm II in the midsummer of that year at 29 years of age. Wilhelm's rise to the throne did not automatically lead to Bismarck's dismissal. Still, there were clear problems straight away. Firstly, Wilhelm was much more determined to exercise control over government affairs, whereas his grandfather had spent 3 decades trying to devolve as much responsibility as possible onto Bismarck's shoulders. Secondly, Wilhelm did not agree with the cautious foreign policy that Bismarck had followed for years. The Iron Chancellor had developed his policy with the intention of not disrupting the balance of power in Europe any more than German unification already had. The key was not to upset the British too much or to create fears of German domination of the continent. Wilhelm perceived this approach as weakness rather than shrewdness. This disagreement on foreign policy matters soon expanded into disputes over domestic affairs in 1889, and Wilhelm was seen regularly interrupting Bismarck during council meetings at the highest levels of government. If Bismarck's position had been dependent on the Reichstag, as the post of Prime Minister was on the support of Parliament in Britain by that time, Bismarck might have survived. However, he served solely with the blessing of the Kaiser, and so when Wilhelm demanded his resignation in the spring of 1890, Bismarck had no option other than to offer it on the 18th of March. He retired to his estates and lived out his life in 1898, writing his memoirs and trying to portray the new Kaiser in the worst light possible. Wilhelm would never find a chancellor as capable as the one he fired in 1890. Excluding a succession of wartime chancellors who held office for brief spells in 1917 and 1918, there were 4 men whom Wilhelm gave his trust to as head of the government from 1890 onwards. Leo von Caprivi was the first of these. During his 4 years in office from 1890 to 1894, he placated the socialists and managed to please Wilhelm by reorienting the country's foreign policy, ending the reinsurance treaty with Russia and engaging in more aggressive colonialism. Yet his tenure highlighted what Bismarck had achieved so well: the juggling act that played all constituencies within Germany off against each other. Instead, von Caprivi managed to annoy the conservative Lutheran Prussian Junker class by promising too much free trade to the socialists and too many concessions to the Catholics. Similar issues plagued the lengthy tenure as Chancellor of the Prince of Hohenlohe between 1894 and 1900. His successor, Bernhard von Bülow, served for nearly the entirety of the 1900s. By the time Wilhelm grew tired of this Chancellor and dismissed him in 1909, von Bülow had done considerable damage to Germany's long-term security, fostering a naval race with Britain, pushing Britain, France, and Russia into a close alliance with each other and escalating colonial tensions in Africa. His successor, Theodor von Bethmann-Hollweg, was handed an impossible situation in 1909 and has been viewed poorly, and probably unfairly, for failing to prevent the outbreak of the First World War. What each of these 4 individuals was ultimately guilty of was failing to curtail the worst impulses of a Kaiser who had many bad impulses. Domestic policy was not Wilhelm's major concern, and he viewed foreign affairs and the aggrandizement of Germany's position in the world as something which would be his greatest achievement as Kaiser. Therefore, he was happy to allow the day-to-day practicalities of domestic policy to be handled by the chancellors and other ministers. They were aware that Wilhelm favored what is known as Sammlungspolitik, an idea that translates as collective politics, the notion that Germans should be brought together domestically in unity in order to further the national agenda internationally. It was, in short, a prototype of the kind of corporatist politics which fascism would make widespread in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. What it meant in practice was that an eclectic range of policies were pursued to try to please everyone. Socialists were given socialist concessions, for instance, even though Wilhelm leaned to the far right in terms of his societal and economic politics. This approach was not handled skillfully, however, in the way that Bismarck managed it in the 1870s and 1880s, and in the end the Junker agricultural class ended up achieving too much control over domestic policy, creating simmering tensions which would erupt violently from the late 1910s onwards within Germany. Historians have long ruminated over the psychological factors which might have influenced Wilhelm's approach to being Emperor of Germany. A good proportion have tended to conclude that his disability, combined with his father's distinguished military service and his grandfather's legacy as the unifier of Germany under Prussian rule, had fostered insecurities in Wilhelm, which he compensated for by presenting himself as a martial ruler. He would try over the next quarter of a century to establish Germany as a great military power and an imperial one. Bismarck had always been opposed to Germany entering a rapid race to acquire overseas colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, arguing that these were of little value compared to Germany's growing domestic industries, and that entering the scramble for Africa would only lead to diplomatic tensions with Britain and other nations. Yet even the Iron Chancellor had been unable to stop German enthusiasts for empire acting on their own initiative, and in 1884 and thereafter, German colonial companies acquired land concessions in Africa and on some of the Pacific islands. Wilhelm encouraged this activity after coming to the throne, and by 1900, the German colonial empire included German East Africa, a large territory encompassing modern-day Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, German Southwest Africa approximating to modern-day Namibia, German Cameroon, covering parts of Cameroon, Gabon, and other small parts of the Central African Republic and the Congo, while in Asia, the Germans acquired much of the island of New Guinea, some of the Solomon Islands, and the islands of New Britain and New Ireland, then known as New Mecklenburg, and the Bismarck Archipelago. This colonial expansion, as we will see, would soon create the kind of tension with France and other nations that Bismarck had predicted, while also leading to the earliest genocide of the 20th century. In assessing his desire to build Germany into a major colonial power, part of the policy he pursued was known as Weltpolitik, meaning world politics. Wilhelm's racial and religious views are important. They were not overtly extreme for their time, though they would certainly be considered so today. He had a belief in the basic superiority of white Christian men, but in the second half of the 19th century this was completely normal in Europe and the Americas. In an infamous newspaper interview he gave in the middle of his reign, he expressed this more aggressively, stating, quote, "The future belongs to the white race. Never fear. It belongs to the Anglo-Teuton, the man who came from Northern Europe, the home of the German. It does not belong, the future, to the yellow, nor the black, nor to the olive-coloured. It belongs to the fair-skinned man, and it belongs to Christianity and to Protestantism." Thus, here was Wilhelm stating a very clear racial view, but again, this was not a fringe view for the time. It was a common feature of European activity in the world, and one would have heard similar things being expressed in the corridors of power, though perhaps more subtly, in places like British Delhi and Cairo, French Algiers and Hanoi, Italian Tripoli and Belgian Leopoldville. These racial views would directly shape German foreign policy. In the summer of 1900, an 8-nation alliance was formed consisting of Germany, Britain, France, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Italy, the United States, and Japan to send a large expeditionary force to China to combat the Boxer Rebellion that had broken out as a form of anti-imperialist revolt in the Far East. As the German expedition was preparing to set sail from Bremerhaven near Bremen in northern Germany on the 27th of July 1900, Wilhelm gave an infamous speech referred to as the Hun speech. Here, he compared modern-day Germans to the Huns, the Asiatic people who had descended into Europe in the 4th century AD and who, under their warlord Attila the Hun, built a huge empire across a significant stretch of Eurasia in the 5th century AD, one which virtually brought the Roman Empire to its knees. Then he declared, quote, "If you come before the enemy, he will be defeated. No quarter will be given. Prisoners will not be taken. Whoever falls into your hands is forfeited, just as 1,000 years ago the Huns under their king Attila made a name for themselves, one that even today makes them seem mighty in history and legend. So may the name Germany be affirmed by you in such a way in China." These racial views of Wilhelm were not idly speculative or theoretical statements that didn't have real-world consequences. In 1901, Wilhelm humiliated the Chinese government by insisting that Prince Chun, the future Zaifeng Emperor of China, travel around the world to Germany to apologize for the death of Baron Clemens von Kettler, a German diplomat in Beijing at the height of the Boxer Rebellion. Much more nefariously, a few years after Wilhelm delivered the Hun speech in 1900, matters took a decidedly darker turn in German Southwest Africa, the region corresponding with modern-day Namibia. This vast territory was over 1.5 times the size of the German Empire in Europe. Despite its sheer enormity, the Germans were trying to rule over it with just around 2,500 German administrators and colonists. Another 1,500 or so Afrikaner or Boer settlers had migrated to the region from South Africa. Beyond these, there were over 150,000 natives in the colony, variously coming from the Herero, Ovambo, and Nama or Namakwa people. The Nama, though numerically the smallest group, had rebelled several times in the 1890s against the encroaching German colonial government. The Herero soon joined them in these insurrections. One revolt in the first weeks of 1904 was particularly disruptive, leading the German governor, Lothar von Trotha, to commence a genocidal campaign against the Herero and the Nama. First, he drove them out of their homesteads and corrals into the desert region and blocked any retreat back towards the more hospitable territory. Tactics like this were deployed over the next 4 years, leading to the deaths of nearly all of the Nama people in German Southwest Africa, some 10,000 of them, and anywhere between 25,000 and 70,000 Herero. Far from condemning this, the first major genocide of the 20th century, Wilhelm supported von Trotha's actions. Indeed, the language which he used to refer to the Herero and Nama in speeches he gave in the mid-1900s mirrored the text of the Hun speech and clearly contributed to the genocide. All of it was also a striking forerunner of the rhetoric of Aryan supremacy which would characterize far-right politics in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. The 1900s saw a number of events occur which impacted in a major way on Wilhelm's state of mind. Through a combination of them, the initial zeal he had shown for government in the 1890s was dampened, and he became a less interventionist figure in the politics of Germany. The first such incident happened on the 6th of March 1901. While riding through the streets of Bremen on a visit to the city, Wilhelm was attacked by a mentally unstable individual by the name of Dietrich Weiland. It may go too far to call it an assassination attempt. Weiland was insensible, had seemingly no major motive, and his method of attack was to throw an iron fish plate at Wilhelm's head. Still, The offending item struck Wilhelm in the face and left a 1.5-inch scar. Under other circumstances, it could have blinded him, and in an age when powerful European leaders were known to be assassinated, for example, Tsar Alexander II of Russia, having been killed in 1881 when bombs were thrown at his sled in the streets of St. Petersburg by political extremists, the incident in 1901 cannot but have made Wilhelm more cautious about his personal safety. More troubling were the developments of the period from 1907 to 1909. Wilhelm was at the centre of two major controversies during these years. On the 28th of October 1908, an infamous interview Wilhelm had given to a British Army officer, Edward Montague Stuart Wortley, appeared in print in the pages of the Daily Telegraph. Not everything in the interview was accurate. However, the German government had failed to adequately check the text and had okayed it for publication when sent a copy prior to it being printed. In it, Wilhelm had referred to the English as being quite mad as March hares, while he made numerous other unwise statements about other nations and international diplomacy. For instance, he implied that both France and Russia, who were allied with Britain by 1908, had tried to encourage the Germans to intervene in the Second Boer War, fought in South Africa between 1899 and 1902, Germany having troops nearby in German Southwest Africa. The article was clearly sensationalized, yet that did not stop it doing a lot of damage to Wilhelm's reputation. This all came in the midst of a long-running scandal within Germany between 1907 and 1909. It centered on the person of Prince Philipp von Eulenburg. Since they had first become acquainted back in 1886, Philipp, who was 12 years older than the Kaiser, had been Wilhelm's closest friend and advisor. In 1907, a scandal broke out when it was revealed that von Eulenburg was involved in a homosexual relationship with a German general, Kuno von Moltke. Homosexuality was illegal under the 1871 Constitution of the German Empire. Court-martials and trials followed as others were implicated in their circle, and the scandal dragged on into 1909. Rumours of widespread homosexuality around Wilhelm's court were not helped when a military secretary, Dietrich von Hulsen-Hasler, had a heart attack and died while performing a ballet dance dressed in a pink tutu before a royal hunting party in the Black Forest region on the 14th of November 1908. Owing to both the Eulenburg affair and the Daily Telegraph incident, Wilhelm suffered a nervous breakdown around this time, one from which he never fully recovered. It is now believed by many historians that Wilhelm had severely repressed homosexual tendencies which he found impossible to express in a society which was deeply homophobic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The debacle of the Daily Telegraph interviews simply compounded what was already an escalating diplomatic crisis with the British. As early as the 1890s, the German admiral, Alfred von Tirpitz, had been encouraging Wilhelm to begin expanding the German fleet in the hopes of rivaling the British Royal Navy one day. Wilhelm was in agreement, and German spending on battleships, frigates and gunboats increased year on year. By the 1900s, Britain and Germany were in the early stages of a naval race, with Germany building 3 battleships every year. With the announcement of the completion of the first dreadnought, the cutting edge of naval military hardware, by Britain in 1906, a new supplementary funding bill was fast-tracked through the Reichstag to increase the number of battleships being completed each year from 3 to 4, an act which finally brought the naval race onto the front pages of newspapers across the Anglophone world. Little surprise, then, that Britain was drawn into an entente cordiale with France in 1904 and was moving closer to Russia diplomatically. This was a foolish policy approach on Wilhelm's part, the sort of thing Bismarck would never have countenanced. There was never any hope that Germany could catch up with Britain navally, and by the time war finally came in 1914, the Royal Navy still eclipsed the German Navy by nearly 2-to-1 in battleships, and more than that in most areas other than submarine warfare. The war at sea would accordingly be limited. All that the naval race achieved was to further alienate Britain from Germany when the Kaiser's government should have been focusing on its strengths as a land power with the most effective military on the continent. It wasn't just the naval race that was leading to escalating tensions. By the dawn of the 20th century, Morocco was one of the very few corners of Africa that was not controlled entirely as a European colony. The French had ambitions there, as they controlled Algeria to the east and much of northwestern Africa to the south of Morocco, around Senegal and Mali. Wilhelm had other ideas, and in March 1905 he set off on a state visit to Tangiers, where he publicly declared his support for Morocco's independence in what was clearly intended as a rebuke to French ambitions. A diplomatic crisis followed, leading eventually to the Algeciras Conference, where Moroccan independence was affirmed, while Wilhelm's position as a troublemaker on the international stage was also confirmed. A second Moroccan crisis followed in 1911 as Germany demanded compensation for allowing the French to take over Morocco as a protectorate. The only thing this gunboat diplomacy succeeded in was driving Britain, which in the late 19th century had been a rival of Russia's in Central Asia and had nearly ended up at war with France over the Fashoda incident in Sudan in 1898, into an alliance with the French and Russians, one which was much more powerful than the alliance Germany had forged with Austria-Hungary. Eventually, all of this diplomatic tension would boil over into war. It started in a strange manner which did not involve Germany or Wilhelm directly. On the 28th of June 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist while visiting the city of Sarajevo. This could have remained a rather minor diplomatic matter between Austria-Hungary and Serbia had it not been for the heavy-handed response of the government in Vienna in demanding that Serbia allow Austrian forces to enter Serbia and act as they pleased in rooting out the Black Hand, the Serb terrorist group behind the assassination. Then Russia, a rival of Austria-Hungary in the Balkans, responded, and that in turn required both Austria-Hungary and Russia's allies to become involved. Eventually, matters spiraled in late July 1914, and over the space of a week or so, all of the major European powers declared war on one another, pitting Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire against Britain, France, and Russia. The First World War would eventually pull in myriad other powers, notably Japan on the side of Britain, Bulgaria joining the Central Powers led by Germany, and eventually the United States on the side of the British and French in 1917. Wilhelm can hardly be said to have been an innocent bystander in all of this. In the early stages of the July crisis that followed Franz Ferdinand's assassination, he repeatedly assured the government in Vienna that he would support them no matter what course they took. This has been interpreted as the infamous blank check, whereby Wilhelm failed to rein in the Austrians even as they were sending messages to the Serbian government in Belgrade demanding to be allowed to violate Serbian sovereignty to an unacceptable extent. Then, in a fairly incredible move in retrospect, Wilhelm headed off on a 20-day pleasure cruise in the North Sea to Norway on the 6th of July. When he returned after 3 weeks, Europe's peace was teetering on a knife edge, as Russia was mobilizing in response to what was perceived as an imminent declaration of war on Serbia by Austria-Hungary. One can have a little sympathy for Wilhelm's actions once the declarations of war began, as by then it seemed inevitable that Germany would have to respond, but in agreeing with his generals that Germany would now invade neutral Belgium and race towards Paris to try and defeat France before Britain could ever mobilize on the continent, he doomed Europe to 4 years of slaughter. On the 4th of August, Germany invaded Belgium, and Britain declared war in response just hours later. As the diplomatic crisis escalated in the final days of July and early days of August 1914, Wilhelm had expressed a fear to his generals that Germany would become trapped in a two-front war with Britain and France in the west and Russia in the east. The war that now developed was everything he had feared. Germany failed to advance to take Paris in the first weeks of the conflict, providing time for British troops to begin arriving to northern France to reinforce the French position. 4 years of bitter trench warfare would follow there. In the east, a great victory was won at the Battle of Tannenberg within weeks of the conflict commencing, but the Germans had not entered the war with the aim of achieving complete victory on the Eastern Front, and so the necessary resources were not committed to bring about Russia's defeat until its own internal politics collapsed in 1917. Faced with these developments, Wilhelm was increasingly despondent about the drift of the conflict, and it is assumed that he had despaired of the chances of German success long before many others within the high command of the German army. In the course of the war, Wilhelm's role in managing affairs declined ever further over time as the generals acquired more and more power. In particular, 2 individuals who had been responsible for the great victory over the Russians at the Battle of Tannenberg at the beginning of the war, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, acquired more and more power in the course of 1915 and 1916. This has led some historians to characterize Wilhelm as a kind of shadow Kaiser. As the conflict went on, a ruler in name only, whereas a military dictatorship was actually in effect from August 1916, after von Hindenburg became the new chief of the General Staff, with Ludendorff as the first quartermaster general of the armed forces. Thereafter, Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg attempted to continue to exercise some form of civilian control over the government, but Wilhelm became increasingly detached from events, doing little more than showing up when requested to attach medals to the breasts of war veterans and to carry out other public duties to bolster morale. He rubber-stamped the fateful decision in February 1917 to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, but it was von Hindenburg, Ludendorff, and the other generals that had effectively made the decision. Bethmann Hollweg tried to resist it and was removed from office not long afterwards for his troubles. It had the exact impact that many predicted. The sinking of several American ships within weeks brought the US into the war on the side of Britain and France, and even with the revolutions in Russia knocking that country out of the war before long, Germany's cause was now hopeless, as American resources and troops began arriving to Europe. The war now entered its last desperate phase. In this, the German generals began organizing a last major offensive in the West in the hopes of making a breakthrough before so many US troops arrived that they would swing the tide completely against Germany. After a strangely subdued winter season in the trenches, the German spring offensive of 1918 began, leading to major gains initially, though not of the kind needed. Soon the advance stalled and was rolled back. In the autumn, the British, French, and Americans began pressing the Germans towards their own borders. Soon the war would be taken into Western Germany itself. Throughout these events, Wilhelm claims that he was distracted by efforts to rescue his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, and his family from the Bolshevik communists in Russia. This was a somewhat contradictory development. In 1917, his government had facilitated Vladimir Lenin's return to Russia from exile in Switzerland following the February Revolution, but within a year he was unsuccessfully trying to stop his cousin from being killed at the hands of the Bolsheviks. By the end of October 1918, it was not only clear that Germany was going to lose the war before long as the French, British, and Americans prepared to take the conflict onto German soil, but also that German society was fracturing at the seams as food shortages and the basics of daily life ended up in short supply everywhere. The erroneously named Spanish flu, which was first detected in Kansas in the United States, was also beginning to impact on the country. Wilhelm himself possibly contracted it in 1918. In response to the myriad crises, revolts and protests began in many German cities and in and around Berlin, inspired by similar revolts in Russia and Austria-Hungary over the previous year. Then, on the 3rd of November 1918, sailors of the German Navy at anchor in the port of Kiel revolted against the military high command. On the 4th, they took over the town of Kiel. His ministers now approached Wilhelm and informed him that drastic measures were needed. It was also clear that a ceasefire could not be secured in France while Wilhelm was still in the picture. The British and French having told the US President Woodrow Wilson that no peace was possible until Wilhelm renounced his position as Kaiser. Realizing that it was over, Wilhelm agreed to abdicate and to also renounce the claims of the wider House of Hohenzollern to the imperial title. The Chancellor, Prince Maximilian of Baden, made the announcement to the German nation on the 9th of November that Wilhelm had abdicated even as Germany continued to descend into the chaos of the German Revolution, which would continue long into 1919. Even as news of his abdication was spreading across Germany, Wilhelm and his family were making their final preparations to leave Germany, doubtlessly scared by the fate of Wilhelm's cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, who had first been detained by the revolutionaries in Russia and then murdered along with his family in the summer of 1918. Arrangements were reached with the government of the Netherlands, which had remained neutral in the war, whereby Wilhelm and his family could go into exile there. So it was that the imperial train set off from Spa in Belgium on the 10th of November, where the imperial military headquarters was located, to the border of the Netherlands. On the train platform, soldiers and refugees gave shouts of "murderer" and "traitor" at the former emperor. One day later, news filtered through that an armistice had been agreed between the interim German government and the Entente powers, bringing the First World War to an end. When he arrived to the Netherlands, Wilhelm was first allowed to reside temporarily at Kasteel Amerongen, and then later was provided with a large manor and estate at Doorn. He would never be visited or given an official invitation to court by Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, much to his irritation, though the Netherlands government did resist calls by the British to extradite Wilhelm to stand trial. On the 28th of November 1918, Wilhelm issued a short written confirmation of his abdication. Wilhelm had hardly lost everything. In the final weeks of 1918 and into 1919, convoys carrying tens of millions of dollars worth of artworks, furniture, and other valuable items arrived to the Netherlands from Germany. He also had substantial cash assets, and he soon purchased the Doorn estate from the Dutch government, while a large number of castles, properties, and estates in Germany continued to belong to the Hohenzollerns under the Weimar Republic that was established there in the course of 1919. Without any financial worries, he began something of a literary and scholarly career. For instance, he developed an interest in ancient Greek archaeology, working on vacations spent at the Achilleon Palace he had purchased on the Greek island of Corfu back in 1907. Much of this written output, though, was self-serving. He began to work on his memoirs while at Doorn, and these were clearly designed to exonerate himself and justify his actions as Kaiser as much as possible. In fairness to him, in a post-war environment where Germany had been blamed entirely for causing the war by Britain and France, and he in particular had been vilified for years as the Germanic warlord who had fomented the chaos, some pushback on Wilhelm's part was probably somewhat justified. Wilhelm's personal life in the Netherlands also took a major turn. His son, Joachim, a competent military officer and a figure who had been considered as a possible king of several countries during the war, took his own life on the 18th of July 1920 in despair over the combined effects of the collapse of the imperial regime in Germany, a divorce from his wife, and financial difficulties. This, in turn, led to a precipitous decline in his mother, Wilhelm's wife's, health, and she died less than a year later in the late spring of 1921. Her body was repatriated to Germany and buried at Potsdam near Berlin. Because Wilhelm was prohibited from returning to Germany, he could only accompany her coffin to the border. Devastated by her loss, Wilhelm found some comfort in letters sent to him from the family of Princess Ermina Reuss of Greiz. He invited them to visit him at Doorn and soon married Ermina in November 1922, despite her being 28 years his junior. They had no children, though it was a warm family environment at Doorn, as Hermina had 5 children from her first marriage to Prince Johann of Schöneich-Carolat, who had died in 1920. One could even call it a pastoral existence in the Dutch countryside in the years that followed, with Hermine and Wilhelm both writing memoirs, learning to speak Dutch, and Wilhelm even becoming a lumberjack, cutting wood on the estate as a hobby and providing it for free to the poorer locals. In the Netherlands in the early 1930s, Wilhelm could not but take an interest in the rapidly changing politics of his homeland. The Wall Street crash and the economic crisis of the Great Depression that followed hit Germany particularly badly owing to its huge debts and reparations payments and weaknesses within its banking system. As millions were impoverished and lost their jobs, they turned to extremist parties, above all the National Socialists, or Nazis, led by Adolf Hitler. When they attained power in the early months of 1933, it must have seemed like something of a new dawn to many old German aristocrats, as the Nazis were accommodating of the old imperial princes and nobility, allowing them to resume their titles that had been abolished under the Weimar Constitution back in 1919. A huge proportion joined the Nazi Party. Wilhelm, though, was more sceptical, and he was opposed to it when his fourth son, August Wilhelm, joined the Nazis in 1930. Aui, as his family called him, was soon being exploited by the Nazis for propaganda purposes, though he was quickly sidelined once they achieved power in 1933. Meanwhile, Wilhelm's views hardened following the Night of the Long Knives in the summer of 1934, coming to perceive Hitler as a gangster, though his relationship with Hermann Göring, a figure who had a rosier perception of the old German Empire and its constitution and colonies, was much more cordial, and he visited him on several occasions at dawn. Wilhelm's views on the Nazis became even more hostile following the Night of the Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht, attacks on Jewish people all across Germany and the recently annexed territories of Austria and the Sudetenland on the 9th and 10th of November 1938. Nearly 100 Jews were killed initially by the Nazi regime, thousands more were arrested, and businesses and synagogues were destroyed all across Germany, with hundreds more deaths following through people taking their own lives as well as detentions. Wilhelm's views on the Jewish people were complicated. He had imbibed much of the anti-Semitism which had become particularly rabid in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, yet at the same time he had a number of associates and even friends over the years who were Jewish, notably the German industrialist Walter Rathenau. He indicated his disgust at the Kristallnacht attacks and derided his son Aui for indicating his support for the Nazi actions, although this conflicts sharply with statements made by Wilhelm years earlier about being in favor of pogroms against Germany's Jews. The latter statements were made in November 1918, when the German Empire was collapsing around him and he was being told he would have to abdicate. A year and a half later, in the twilight of his life, Wilhelm was in a more conflicted position when the Nazis commenced their successful invasion of the Low Countries and France in May 1940, after the inception of the Second World War the previous September. The rapid conquest of Western Europe that followed was essentially a successful version of the plan which Wilhelm's generals had tried to implement back in 1914, only to get bogged down in the trenches of northeastern France and Belgium. In the aftermath of this, perhaps conscious that he and his family were now living under Nazi rule in the Netherlands, he wrote to Hitler congratulating him on his success, while also noting that many of his leading generals had been trained by his government back in the 1890s, 1900s, and 1910s. He must have also been conscious that many of his sons and grandsons were serving in the German military by that time. Wilhelm would not live to see his second eldest son, Eitel Friedrich, be killed in 1942 during the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. On the 4th of June 1941, Wilhelm suffered a pulmonary embolism at home in Dorn and died at 82 years of age. Wilhelm had outlined in his last will that he wanted to be laid to rest in the Netherlands and not returned to Germany unless the monarchy was restored in some fashion in the future, while he also did not want any Nazi role being played in his funeral. One wish was honoured, the other wasn't. His funeral took place in the Netherlands, but Nazi swastikas and banners were prominently on display as the regime made the most that it could of the event, despite Hitler's loathing of a figure he viewed as responsible in large part for Germany's defeat in the First World War. A mausoleum, though admittedly a relatively modest one, was erected on the Kaiser's estate in Dorn to house his remains, one which is a venerated site for German monarchists down to the present day. The House of Hohenzollern is alive and well today, though the basic law of the Federal Republic of Germany, established in 1949, prohibits any calls for a monarchy to be restored. Much of the family's estates in eastern Germany were seized by the Soviet Union after the war, while Haus Dorn in the Netherlands became a national museum. George Friedrich, Prince von Preußen, Wilhelm's great-great-grandson, is the head of the family line today. Wilhelm II was one of the most significant and controversial figures in the history of modern Germany. Assessments of his reign have varied considerably. Traditionally, he was perceived as having fomented the First World War as part of his efforts to aggrandize Germany and dominate the continent. Revisionists in the late 20th century sought to reappraise this view, arguing that Germany was not as responsible for the outbreak of the First World War as many nations contended back in the 1910s. There is some truth to this, and few historians today would argue that Germany was exclusively responsible for the war. But these reassessments aside, there is no doubt that Wilhelm was an incredibly destructive character. He was possessed of a dangerous combination of being extremely ambitious and also not being anywhere near as intelligent as he believed himself to be. He removed one of the greatest statesmen of modern times from his position as Chancellor of Germany, and then, over the next quarter of a century, pushed Europe towards war with his jingoistic approach to government. What was perhaps worse was the drift of society and political culture in Germany during his time as Kaiser. Nazism and the Third Reich did not emerge in a vacuum. There were serious problems that emerged within German society in Wilhelm's day, which presaged it, whether it was the drift towards radicalism domestically or the orchestration of genocide in Namibia in the 1900s. Wilhelm might have been critical of the Nazis later, but he bears a considerable amount of blame for the terror visited on Europe in the first half of the 20th century. What do you think of Kaiser Wilhelm II? Is he largely responsible for the horrors of the First World War and the genocidal conduct of Germany in Africa? Or were other factors to blame, namely Franco-British opposition to the rise of Germany and structural flaws in the political system created by Bismarck in the 1870s and 1880s? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Thank you for watching People Profiles documentaries. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notifications so you never miss an upload. If you would like to watch our videos with no adverts of any kind, listen to audio podcast versions of our videos, discuss history with other People Profiles fans, and much, much more, go to peopleprofiles.com and become a member for as little as $2 per month. Members can also receive discounted merchandise, behind-the-scenes material, and a credit in our videos, along with much more. So, please support us in our work in return for exclusive offers at peopleprofiles.com via the link in the video description. Thank you very much for watching.